Welcome back to the second episode of The Logic of Risk. I am thrilled with the number of downloads so far and want to thank you all for your nice comments and suggestions. If you are enjoying this podcast, please spread the word and give it a good rating on your favorite platform. And if this is your first time listening to The Logic of Risk, welcome. I recommend checking out the first episode since we are building our discussion from the ground up. Some of you have reported audio issues, which I am currently addressing. It is not just about adjusting the microphone though, so I asked for a bit of your patience. The person speaking here is not the real Pasquale, but his digital clone, or more precisely, a clone of his voice. This requires a bit of fine-tuning on the underlying generative model, but I am sure actually both I and the human with the original voice are sure that in a few episodes we will converge on something good. In these initial episodes we are a bit more, allow me the expression, philosophical and less quantitative. That's not a quirk, but a necessity. It's crucial to understand the fundamental characteristics of risk and uncertainty before we can address their modeling in a satisfactory way. The clearer we are about the problems we are working on, the better equipped we will be to tackle them. In the last episode, we gave a preliminary definition of risk, which I will repeat here for convenience. For us, a risk is the possibility of harm or damage, that is, an event with negative consequences caused by internal and or external vulnerabilities or reasons which can potentially be contained at least in part, if not entirely avoided. This definition expands and makes more operational the simpler version you'd find in various dictionaries. We also said that uncertainty is something else, which, with a bit of terminological abuse, we labeled as unquantifiable risk. But as I mentioned, that is just the start. To manage risk effectively, we need more precision. Today, I want to take a closer look with you at the concept of harm. Since risk is the possibility of harm, an event with negative consequences and so on, how can we evaluate that harm? How can we weigh its inherent negativity? In the previous episode, I brought up the problem of subjectivity. It is very hard to separate potential harm from the subject to whom that harm applies, and also from the evaluator, as will become clear if those two individuals are not the same person. If we consider the loss of $1,000 from our example last week, we can assume nobody wants to lose that amount of money, but the impact certainly differs for someone who is poor versus someone who is wealthy. As far as I'm concerned, one of my favorite ways of tackling this issue, and certainly one of the best ways to start striving for both simplicity and rigor, is inspired by Kinney and Rescher. Let us begin by saying that the impact or magnitude of a harm of some negative event can be described succinctly by three dimensions: nature, extent, and timing. Nature is simply the type of harm we are assessing. Is it material, financial, psychological, a physical injury, death, boredom, the cancellation of our favorite TV series? Essentially, we care about its qualitative nature. We will see that the most sensible and reliable comparisons, so as not to fall into a long list of fallacies, which we will discuss later, and to avoid ethical complexities, are comparisons between harms of the same nature. We don't want to compare apples and oranges. Extent, more quantitative than nature, can be divided into severity and distribution. Severity is some measure of the loss generated by the negative event. We use loss in a broad sense, not necessarily financial. If you like, it answers the question, how much? This question will be phrased according to the type of harm. So it will always be a conditional quantification. Of course, the context matters. Are we talking about units of time, money, health status? Knowing this is of paramount importance. Distribution pertains to the type of individuals affected by the harm and their number. Are these well identified individuals, or do they fall into what we might call a statistical blur? For example, are we talking about 3 firefighters who died trying to extinguish a specific fire, or more generally about on the job fatalities in a given country in 2024? When evaluating distribution in order to facilitate, among other things, risk communication and to ensure reliable and acceptable estimates, remember, not objective estimates, we also need to look at our relationship with the people harmed. Are they us? Are they our family, friends, strangers? Do they live close to us and thus potentially affect us? This is one of the many reasons why experts are expected to be both competent and independent. Timing is the third dimension of a harm's magnitude. Are we talking about an imminent or a future negative event? Is it a one-time event or something that could recur? How long does exposure last? A disaster that kills 50,000 people in one go is one thing. A chronic situation that kills the same number over a generation is another, and yet another if we are talking about future generations, with hope that something might be done in the meantime. To evaluate and compare risks and thus to rank them, we need to measure them, quantify them, so we can assess their relative severity. Unfortunately, there is no guarantee that different negative factors can be measured in the same units, making them directly commensurable. As mentioned earlier, this is especially true if the harms differ in nature. How can we unambiguously compare a financial loss to pain, or to a prolonged feeling of boredom, or to other similar things? Is it worse to break a leg or lose $10,000? It gets even more complicated when the decision isn't for us, but for someone else. And don't think that the quantitative aspects are free of their own issues. Is a severe but less widespread harm better or worse than a less severe but more widespread harm? This brings to mind many comments about different contagious diseases, for example. I find certain absolute stances on these issues both discouraging and, paradoxically, ethologically fascinating. Perhaps the people who take these stances have preference orderings with zero ambiguity, or maybe they are just talking for the sake of talking. Let me offer a provocative yet current example, exaggerating but not by too much, the difficulty of balancing severity and distribution when evaluating the extent of harm. We are essentially discussing what we might call the risk profile. How can we compare a scenario where many people are incapacitated to one where just a few die? Someone might suggest using lost workdays as the unit of comparison. Mind you, it is not so unusual a choice as a comparison metric, regardless of what you might think. We will talk more about the value of life in later episodes. Now, consider these two alternatives. Situation 1, two 20-year-olds die, each with 50 potential working years ahead of them. Situation 2, temporary incapacitation of 15,000 workers due to an illness that causes, on average, 10 days of lost work. In the first scenario, we can estimate workdays lost as 2 times 50 times 365. That comes to 36,500 lost workdays, and we are clearly exaggerating the number of workdays in a single year. In the second scenario, we have 15,000 workers times 10 lost workdays on average, that is roughly 150,000 lost workdays. So if we only look at workdays lost, the first situation appears preferable to the second. But I don't have to imagine too hard to see the outrage on many faces, and I totally share that outrage. This is a simple but hardly uncommon example showing that comparing risk situations is anything but trivial. You can't just calculate two quick numbers and put them side by side. I love calling these situations illusions of comparability. The fact that different parameters we use to estimate harm may not be commensurable, especially between different types of harm, is one of the fundamental and far-reaching aspects of risk management. It is crucial to grasp this, both for developing a healthy approach to risk and for avoiding problems for ourselves and others. We will come back to this concept more than once, just as we accept that distance and temperature can't be expressed using the same unit. We need to be prepared to understand that in certain situations, different risks aren't trivially comparable with a single number, even if they might look like it. They are simply not commensurable. Yet we often hear statements like the risk of contracting this disease is lower than the risk of being eaten by a shark. When we talk about the fallacy of scale, we will start right there. So, what do? Do we give up? Of course not. This is precisely why we are here. Whenever we consider a particular class of harm, that is, we fix the nature of what we are assessing, it is always possible to compare different situations within that class. Once we fix the nature of the harm, we are left with its extent in its two components, severity and distribution, and timing. Without having a precise risk measure yet, let us assume that for each of these characteristics, we can assign one of three levels: high, medium, and low. So, a given harm might be characterized by a high level of severity, but a low level of distribution. When it comes to timing, simplifying a bit for now, thus ignoring frequency for instance, we say high means imminent and low means far off in the future, with medium somewhere in between. The worst harm would then have the triplet: high, 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 that is, high severity, high distribution, and high timing. Conversely, the least impactful harm would be low, low, low. Between these two extremes, we can list 25 other combinations of high, medium, and low. Altogether, that is 27 possibilities, 3 to the power of 3, 3 distinct levels for 3 different characteristics. Some of these situations can be easily ranked. For instance, we'd say that in terms of risk, the high, high, high scenario dominates all the others. If in terms of risk X dominates Y, that means X is riskier than Y. By the same logic, medium, high, high dominates medium, medium, high, as well as medium, high, medium, and low, high, high, because if two factors remain the same and one improves, that is, it becomes less dangerous, the risk cannot increase. To be precise, we should say it cannot get worse, but we will get back to this later. And the same holds if one factor remains the same and the other two improve, or if all three improve. Transitivity also applies in general, meaning that if the triplet medium, medium, high dominates medium, 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 then the triplet medium, high, high also dominates medium, medium, medium. Now, because I don't want to lose you, and I know listening to triplets is boring, it is best to sum all this up with a graphic that lays out these different triplets and shows how they compare. But how can we do that on a podcast? You will find the answer on thelogicofrisk.com. From now on, you will find any extra materials for each episode right there. For episode 2, the relevant figure is already waiting for you. It becomes trickier to determine whether medium, high, high dominates high, medium, high because you don't see a straightforward improvement in one factor while holding the others constant. In that case, for one factor that improves, another factor gets worse. For the time being, the best answer is that we can't automatically say we don't have enough tools for that yet, so we will come back to it. If you are really curious, we can say that comparability and the possibility of consistent ranking will subjectively depend on who is evaluating the risk. That requires an axiological perspective, or in other words, a value scale. Two harms, especially if they differ in nature, are not automatically comparable or commensurable in their intrinsic qualities, but they can become so extrinsically through the evaluator. This, however, raises the issue of the evaluator's reliability, which leads us to the question of experts and a host of related complications that will take more time to address. We will come back to them in due course. Naturally, if we decided to use more characteristics to define the magnitude of a risk, we could talk about quadruplets, quintuplets, and so on instead of triplets, but that detail isn't really important right now. What matters is understanding that describing harm properly requires a profile, and this profile can be obtained by considering different features, each measured in some way. We are the ones who choose and manage these features, and therefore the harm profile and more generally the risk profile. There are heuristics and conventions, but there is no single, always valid solution, nor a single absolute truth. Believing that we can find one universal metric, perhaps using some ready-made little model to solve every problem, is akin to returning to the lost workdays example, and probably preferring fatalities. Risk assessment, starting with assessing harm, because then it all gets more complicated when we factor in probability, has both a factual and a normative component. The factual component is the scientific one related to characterizing the harm, its severity, its distribution, its timing, and later on, its probability. I said scientific, not objective. It is a matter of observing phenomena, gathering data, theorizing, creating and choosing models, and extracting information in a largely inductive manner following the scientific method and best practices wherever possible. But this information then needs to be processed, weighed, and assigned values. We need to decide what is acceptable and what is not. Let us remember, it is not the facts that decide, but people. People are the ones who transform facts into values. Of course, for those judgments to be intelligent, and if you will allow me the term rational, we will return to the concept of rationality later, they must take the facts into account. However, we cannot separate the responsibility of comparing different negatives from the person doing the comparison and then blame it all on the nature of things. In risk management, reality is never entirely separate from the subject, whether that subject is the risk manager or the potential victim. I can't emphasize this enough. Claiming otherwise invites trouble and mere buck passing. Well, I think that is enough to bore you with for today. I want to wrap up this episode with a quote from T.S. Eliot. Only those who will risk going too far can possibly find out how far one can go. See you next time and visit thelogicofrisk.com.